Domus sanctificationis Tuae, et gloriae Tuae, humila graverunt peccates nostri, rorare celi Jesum et nubes truant
Welcome to the Exploring the Faith YouTube channel. I'm Cole DeSantis. I'm joined today by Larry Chapp, a former professor of theology at DeSales University and the manager and owner of the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker Farm. Today we will be discussing the crisis in the church, sort of the nature of the crisis in the church and its relation to evangelization and social life more broadly. So with that in mind, I'd like to thank you, Larry, for joining me and really looking forward to a good interview.
Well, it's my pleasure as someone who also does podcasting myself. I always like to help out fellow podcasters when they request my presence on their show. And so I'm very happy and pleased to be here today, Cole. It's nice to meet you.
Definitely. Well, we're glad to have you here. So the first question really sets the stage for all the other questions, and
Okay.
it's a question that it's a deceptively simple question, but it's simply this: what is evangelization? And sort of building on that is most people will define evangelization along the terms of like spreading the gospel or spreading the message of salvation. And
hmm
so, but what exactly is the gospel? How have
Yeah.
Catholics understood it? And, what are the different theological dynamics at play when we talk about the gospel?
That's a great question because we hear people say that all the time, that evangelization is about spreading the gospel, the gospel. Well, the gospel is essentially, I mean, it's from a word that means the good news, euangelion in Greek, good news, good news. So when the first apostles went out and were preaching the Christian faith to their fellow Jews and to the pagan Romans, they referred to it as the good news. Well, so therefore, in order to define what we mean by the gospel, it's imperative that we understand what it was that the Apostolic Church considered to be that good news. And I think that in its essence, I think the good news is fundamentally defined as the breaking down of barriers. The first barrier that is broken down is that between Jew and Gentile. Okay, that the incarnation of Christ is the fulfillment of God's covenant with the Jewish people, and that God's promise that through Abraham, all the peoples of the world, all the nations of the world would eventually be blessed, is going to come to fruition. So now the offer of becoming sons and daughters of Abraham is extended to the Gentile world. So that barrier is brought down. But that barrier is brought down by the bringing down of an even more fundamental barrier, the barrier between God and humanity in general. And that involves God's atoning death for our sins in the incarnation of Christ and his death on the cross, but then the ultimate victory over the death that sin causes. So it's not just to forgive our sins, it's also to get victory over what sin causes. And what sin causes, as St. Paul points out, is death. All right. So the barrier that comes down is the barrier between us and God in terms of sin, and then the barrier between us and God in terms of death, so that we are now risen. But we're not just risen into immortality, we're risen into union with God by incorporation into Christ. So there's an element of divinization, an element of theosis. So this is powerfully good news in the early apostolic church to both the Jewish and the pagan world. Sins are forgiven, and we are to be now resurrected from the dead and raised up into the divine life. We're not just going to go to Paradise Park in the sky. We're going to be raised into the divine life itself. And that is the essence of the good news that the apostles went out into the pagan Roman world and preached. And so when we say we're going to evangelize and we're going to spread the gospel, I think we need to remember that that was its original meaning. The breaking down of barriers between Jew and Gentile and God and man, and the atoning death of Christ, in order that we might become one with God, in union with God, in divinized and raised up. I think that's the essence of the gospel.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, a lot of people talk about the gospel simply in terms of the forgiveness of sins. And I think you touched
Yeah.
on a point here that I think deserves elaboration. I mean, it's the notion of the forgiveness of sins is inseparable from a renewal of human nature more generally. And this can be seen in, again, you had mentioned this, the incarnational center of the gospel, of God becoming man, of uniting created reality to himself in order to purify it and elevate it. So I guess this leads to sort of a broader, I could say, existential, metaphysical, metaethical question of what elements of human existence are really touched on the most by the gospel message.
Oh gosh, well that's a rather profound and in-depth question. What elements of human nature that would require us to do a deep dive into a fundamental Christian understanding of anthropology. What are people for? What are people? All right, and therefore, since we are made for union with God, and we're made in the image of God, and sin effaces that image and creates a barrier with our union with God. One would have to say that the fundamental thing that is healed in human nature is that part of us that most reflects the divine image, and therefore that part of us which is capable of an analogical connection with God. And what part is that? That would be our reason and our will, the two main spiritual faculties of the human being, our reason and our will. And those have to be healed. It's not simply enough for our sins to be forgiven. Catholics, we also believe in sanctification, not just justification. And to be sanctified means to be healed. And that means the general elevation of our intellect into the things of God, into, to put on the mind of Christ, as St. Paul says, which means a metanoia, a conversion of the mind. Thomas Aquinas spoke about this a lot, about intellectual sins are actually horrible sins because they create distortions with the mind. And when the mind has distortions, especially on the conceptual level within it, that leads to disordered desires in the will. Because the essence of all sin, by the way, as Aquinas points out, right? Nobody ever chooses evil for the sake of evil in and of itself. We always choose, when we sin, we're always choosing evil under the guise of some good, because our will is naturally oriented to the good. So what is sin? Sin is when one sacrifices a higher good for a lesser good. All right. And so take, for example, the lesser good, say, of sexual satisfaction. Uh, I I I pursue sexual satisfaction with my married neighbor, even though I'm married too, because I find it sensually gratifying. Now, the actual sin there is not the enjoying of the sex. The actual sin, because sexual gratification is a good, as Aquinas points out. All right, the sin is involved is that I'm sacrificing a very low good, sexual satisfaction, to I'm extolling a lesser good, sexual status, at the expense of a much higher good. So in other words, all sin is characterized by a disordering in the hierarchy of goods, and wherein our will starts desiring penultimate ends rather than ultimate ends. Our will starts desiring lower things instead of higher things. And therefore, one has to, in pursuing the gospel, in pursuing sanctification, one has to purge the mind of erroneous ideas in order to reorder the proper hierarchy of goods in our lives, and then to engage in the prudential exercising of fortitude and prudence and so on, in order to train the will, to pursue the higher goods. And the higher goods are often being more spiritual, less immediately satisfying than the sensual goods. And so one has to learn how to delay gratification. One has to learn to mortify the flesh for the sake of the higher intellectual goods. I mean, this is all sort of spirituality 101. But I really do believe that aspect of human nature, that proper relationship between the intellect and the will, and the proper ordering of the goods of our lives, is one of the most important things that God heals within us.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you say presupposes something that's kind of on um, the crossroads of metaphysics and ethics, of evil as privation, right? I mean,
Right.
evil as the
Yeah.
corruption or absence of some do good. And so, with that in mind, I mean, I think a lot of what the Catholic, and I'd venture to say to various degrees, most Christian understandings of salvation, I think what they all ultimately come down to is humans being freed from sin to be what they were created to be. And as a result, we know the truth instead of an illusion. We are unable to desire, or we ought to desire, and we are enabled to desire that which is actually, will fulfill us, that which will actually satisfy us,
Yes.
ultimately, eternally.
Yes.
So, and this leads to the question, why wouldn't anyone want that? And so, what would you say of, and yet at the same time, there's many people who reject the gospel. There's many people who even reject the notion of there's anything beyond this world, worth
Yeah.
striving for. Because at least a person could be sympathetic towards a false religion, because at least a false religion is saying you shouldn't be living a life of vice. You should seek truth. You should seek something higher. So why are people not even interested in that? And what elements of so what do you say think are the biggest obstacles to getting people to accept the gospel? And how many of those obstacles do you think are um, just sort of perennial issues that have always existed since the fall? And how many of those do you think are the result specifically of, social, cultural, intellectual conditions of our own time?
Yeah. I think that uh, the thing that characterizes, I think, original sin more than anything, and the fall, and you mentioned the fall, is precisely uh, the desire of the disordered desire of our first parents to replace ultimate goods with penultimate ones, and then to claim that they are to be the arbiters of what counts as human goods and what don't count as human goods. In other words, they sought to exercise a natural level of control over what constitutes the good, and to reject the divine guidance that God supernaturally provided them as to what constitutes the good. So immediately, what we see when when Adam and Eve choose to rebel against God and to exercise their natural reason over the goods of this world, immediately the goods become disordered. Immediately things begin to fall apart and human nature spins out of control. And therefore, I would say that aspect of the fall has always been with us. The temptation to assert dominance over our own lives in an autonomous way and to go our way without God. You can have gods and so on in a polytheistic environment, but that's different. Polytheistic religions were never about having a proper ordering of the goods or of having a relationship with God. That was kind of about manipulating. That too was about control. I don't have time to go into it too much here. So that's always been with us, this temptation towards a kind of natural desire to control our own lives and to go our own way without God. But the modern world has taken that attitude and put it on steroids, because in the modern world we combine that with a powerful scientistic, not scientific, but scientistic, which is like an ideology of science, an idolatry of science, that wants to reduce everything to the strictly quantifiable, reduce everything to pure material relations, which is another way of saying reducing everything to simply power relations of some kind. And so we have a runaway naturalism in the modern world and a runaway anti-supernaturalism in the modern world. So we've taken the endemic condition caused by the fall, which is a desire to exert power over our own lives vis-a-vis God. And now we've combined that with a powerful atheistic ideology that the material world is all that truly exists. There is no God. And therefore, we have absolute and total control over everything. Now, this ultimately leads to the destruction of and the death of the higher faculties of the soul. We can pretend that it doesn't, but it does. And so you end up with a society of pleasure addicts. You end up with a society addicted to technology and material comfort and the fulfilling of the immediate needs of the sensate self, which is why you see runaway pornographic addiction in our society, runaway drug addiction, runaway alcohol addiction, runaway sexual promiscuity, runaway broken marriages, runaway crime. I mean, and so on, because we have completely idolized sensual material pleasures at the expense of the higher faculties of the soul. So I think you're entirely correct. Even though there are Islam, for example, is a false religion, Buddhism is in many ways a false religion, they do contain some truth within them. And at the very least, the truth that they contain within them is that the material world is not all that exists, and that therefore the higher faculties of the soul need to be cultivated. The problem with Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism is they don't have Christ, and therefore they don't have the proper pathway to the proper hierarchy of the goods that we have. They don't have access to the full truth of human nature and God like we do. And therefore, there's going to remain a strong element of error in those religions that leads to, once again, a disordered hierarchy of the various goods. But at least they do acknowledge the existence of something beyond this life.
But I mean, from a sociological perspective, I mean, one of the most interesting things is just the universality of religion. And psychologically, one of the most interesting things is just the universality of, if not religion, at least the spiritual or religious tendency within man. And so, what exactly are the historical, factors that led to the overturning of this deep-seated element of human nature? So, I mean, your viewpoint is that the big crisis of modernity is acting like what we see here and now is all there is, and just not even that's a new opinion, but the widespread cultural acceptance of that. Why has that become so widespread when, for most of human history and in the lives of most individuals, the exact opposite was one of the most deeply held beliefs that we held?
I think part of it is that for whatever reason, and we can go into great depth about this, read Charles Taylor's famous book, A Secular Age, which is a great, big, huge, thick book. You may have read it. That takes a long time to read, but he lays out, and he's not the only one. It's what we call doing an intellectual genealogy. Louis Dupre famously wrote a book 30 years ago called Passage to Modernity, which is an intellectual genealogy of how we got from A to Z. How do we get from an ancient world that believes in supernatural things to the modern world? And there are a lot of these intellectual genealogies out there that trace this. And they all have different starting points and they all make different emphases. But one of the things that they do all point to is that really beginning in about the 17th century, 1600, in the beginnings of the Enlightenment and the beginnings of the scientific revolution, you see a change in the intellectual classes of Europe in particular, where the intellectual classes, while still believing largely in God, it's simply not true that Enlightenment thinkers were all atheists. Immanuel Kant was not an atheist. Hegel was not an atheist. Spinoza was not an atheist. Descartes was not an atheist. Jean Locke was not an atheist. But what they all did was make a sharp distinction between God and the world. That under the influence of Newtonian physics, Newtonian mechanics, the world came to be viewed as this closed nexus of causality. Okay, and that it sort of was like a self-perpetuating motion machine. So at best, what you get are deistic conceptions of God, right, where God sets the universe up, but then sits back and allows it to unfold. You see this in Thomas Jefferson, right? Nature's God, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are endowed by their blah, 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 blah. Well, that's not self-evident. Jefferson thought it was, but it isn't. All right. So you have these deistic conceptions of God, who was like a tinker toy Lego building sort of giant engineer in the sky, who then makes this perfect universe of material interactions. So at first, when the Enlightenment kicks off, it just begins by, in a sense, kicking God out of the natural world in some sense and saying the material world is sufficient unto itself and God made it that way. Now we have a soul, so when we die, we'll go be with that God. But in terms of practical day-to-day existence, God wants us to use our reason and now the advent of modern science to make and shape the modern world into something more amenable to human flourishing and human material well-being. Now, over time, then Darwinism enters the picture, and now all of a sudden, the deistic God seems superfluous. Darwin now gives, as the atheist Richard Dawkins has said, Darwin gave atheists a respectable and legitimate ideology upon which they could hang their hat. Okay, because now you could say there is no God, the universe is self-creating, life is self-evolving, and so on. In the wake of Darwin, of course, you get Marx, you get Nietzsche, you get people like this, and then the great master of psychological deconstruction, someone like Freud, and so called the masters of suspicion: Marx, Nietzsche, Freud. Marx viewed all power relations as essentially economic. Nietzsche viewed all morality as essentially a power play. And of course, then Freud views everything through the lens of repressed sexuality. But the common thread in all of it is that we're just trousered apes, that we are nothing special. There's no divine spark in us. So the bifurcation between God and world now becomes simply a denial of God, and the world is all there is. So what happens is that the intellectual classes of Europe, starting with the Enlightenment, evolve from essentially God-world distinguishers with a deistic God to a full-blown atheistic and materialistic conception of God. Now that's the intellectual classes, but they've captured our institutions, our educational institutions, our government institutions, all of our major corporate institutions are governed by these intellectual elites who then rule the world as if God doesn't matter. Now the great masses of human beings, the great hoi polloi, continue for the most part to believe in God, especially in the United States, not so much in Europe, in the United States. But it's a faith in God that is now sort of compartmentalized as just one more lifestyle accessory in a garage filled with all kinds of other accoutrements of modern bourgeois existence. And so God simply becomes a therapeutic part of my life to be dragged out as I see fit, made in my own image, and so on. A God that doesn't have this therapeutic quality to enhance the bourgeois well-being of my material comforts is pretty much a useless God to most modern American suburbanites. And so you get a de facto atheism, an atheism of practice, more than an actual ideological superstructure.
And so, it kind of makes sense when you look at the intellectual elites in this society of, they've been heading in a certain direction for quite some time.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the average everyday person, why do you think the average everyday American has this attitude of, I want religion on my terms? Like, what was the broad historical or cultural factors that led to that?
Well, I think the coming together of I think that the Protestant Reformation and the fragmenting of Christianity into a million different pieces leads eventually in European-based societies to a kind of weariness over the religious question in terms of which religion is the true one. Okay, let's say it's the Christian religion. Well, which version of the Christian religion is the true one? There's like 10 million versions of who God is. At least this is the popular mythology. That leads to a kind of relativism of religion that says that religions are, for the most part, human creations and human projections. That even if God exists, and I affirm that God exists, the destruction of Christian unity leads to a confusion that leads to an intellectual, metaphysical weariness where the average person, and you're asking me about the average person, and you hear this all the time, the average person sits back and says, well, what does it matter what religion you belong to so long as you're a good person? Okay, and because they don't have the wherewithal to do a deep dive into the theology and history of religion. So they just sit back and say, okay, I was raised a Lutheran, so I'm going to stay a Lutheran, but that doesn't mean that I think my Catholic friend down the road is going to hell. Catholicism is their truth, and so on. That level of religious relativism then eventually becomes a kind of religious indifferentism. If religion is nothing more than a human projection, a human creation, our own attempt at coming to grips with some aspect of understanding God, then ultimately it loses its bite, its grip, its provocation. Ultimately, it loses its command appeal. Like, this is something that I'm morally obliged to pay attention to. 200, 300 years ago, the average person would have thought it's a moral obligation to worship God properly. So it's important that I get the religion thing right. Modern people don't think like that. It's like, however you worship's fine, so long as you're worshiping something. Come on, what does it matter? All right.
Yeah.
And so there's this indifferentism that creeps in that eventually evolves into a lessening of actual religious practice. And so you get the typical modern person that says, well, I'm spiritual, but not religious. Okay, so I have all these spiritual ideas, but I just don't go to church anymore. Organized institutional religion doesn't speak to me anymore.
Yeah.
And so you get this millions and millions and millions of people who say, I believe in God, and I have happy feelings at sunrises and sunsets, and I have a great hope that when I die, I'm going to go to some Valhalla in the sky.
Yeah.
But I'm really not going to pay much attention to religion otherwise. I'm just going to pay attention to living my life in this world to the best of my ability. And I think that's the way most people are in our society today.
Yeah. Yeah, but though the thing you gotta keep in mind is, we all know this quite well, but the temptation to go down this path has sort of always been there. And certainly
Yeah.
there's been individuals who've thought this way long before it became an acceptable cultural viewpoint. But that's why the church exists. And so the church exists for the sake of sort of guiding humanity in its discussions on God to sort of turn away from these sort of pitfalls. The problem is, you look at the church today, very few people attend church regularly. Most people, pick and choose which parts of church teaching they want to accept. And that happens to be in the rare cases when people actually understand, what the church believes. Most people don't actually understand what the church believes. Most of the clergy seem rather apathetic towards, doctrinal orthodoxy or clarity. Again, not to say there aren't good Catholics or good clergymen, because there are, but a lot of them are fighting an uphill battle. And
They
so
are.
part of the reason why the church is having a difficult time in evangelization is not merely because, society is going through a crisis, but also because the church proper is going through a crisis, which leads to sort of my next question. What is the crisis in the church? Because if you want to be able to properly, efficiently evangelize, you have to understand two things. What's the current state of society? What's the moral crisis of modernity that we need to fight against? And how is that how does that reflect the human condition more generally? But then you have to keep in mind, well, what is the crisis in the church? What are those things in the church that are preventing us from efficiently evangelizing? And so, how would you define the term "the crisis in the church"? Because among faithful Catholics, that's sort of like the phrase de jour. Everybody likes to use that the church is
Yeah.
going through a crisis. How would you describe the crisis in the church?
Well, it's simple. Most Catholics don't believe in God,
Yeah.
and that includes priests and bishops. And even if they explicitly in their mind say, "Oh yeah, I believe in God," they don't really. It's a practical de facto atheism, because if you actually look at how they think and how they live their lives, I mean, it's like Jesus says, "Not everyone who says, 'Lord, Lord,' shall enter the kingdom of heaven." And what he means by that is that one can have a notional assent to the intellectual proposition there is a God. Okay, and in that sense, you're not an atheist. But unless that idea sinks down into your soul, into how you order your life,
Right.
you are in fact living a life of practical atheism. And my claim is that most modern Catholics think with the world, think in these naturalistic, anti-supernaturalistic categories, go to church for largely moralistic reasons or reasons of community and fellowship or some notion that it's good for the kids to have religion in their life or whatever. But most Catholics don't have, I think, a deep and profound conversion experience to actually believing in God in an existentially important way that alters and changes their life. So if you look out and you were to line up 10 million Americans and then observe them in their day-to-day life, all right, and other than the fact that some of them might go to a Catholic church on a Sunday, right? It just based on how they live their lives, would you be able to identify the Catholics from the non-Catholics? And the answer to that is a resounding no, you would not be able to. Not at all. And that's actually a damning indictment, because if Catholics are sincere in their Catholic faith, they ought to be sticking out like a sore thumb in modern American culture. They ought to be like sand in your swimsuit. All right. They ought to be an irritant of monumental proportion, not obnoxious. All right. But we ought to be a countercultural irritant. And we're not. We're simply not. Catholics act the way everybody else acts, which means essentially we think like everybody else thinks. There's been no deep and profound conversion. And therefore, evangelization in the church and directed at Catholics in the church has to be a kind of re-evangelization that seeks the conversion of Catholics to the Catholic faith, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because everyone tends to think simply being baptized and being a regular churchgoer makes you a good Catholic.
No,
but it's not just that. It's understanding and internalizing these truths and trying to live accordingly. And I think that's a great point that you say, because if you live out, I mean, most of society is a reflection of human nature, right? Which means there's going to be a lot of good things about, society, because there's a lot of good things about humans. But there's also going to be a lot of bad things about society, because there's a lot of, corrupt parts of human nature that have been corrupted because of the fall. So to be a good Catholic, or to be a good Christian more generally, means that you're going to live your life in such a way that you're never going to fully fit in to society. But this leads to the question of, all right, well, if we as Catholics, we're called to evangelize the culture, but, Catholics will never be fully fit in so long as they're consistent Catholics.
Yeah.
Well, this then leads to the question of, in evangelization, there's this notion of accompaniment and culturement and culturalization, like this notion of and actively engaging the culture. There's something that was sort of reached a new iteration in the concept of the new evangelization. But there's also a false, I'd say, a false understanding of accompaniment, which is a false understanding of enculturation, which is essentially we just blindly adopt whatever sentiments define the culture. And so where exactly do we draw the line between true and false enculturation, true and false accompaniment?
Well, that's going to be more art than science, and I don't think there's a single sort of set of principles that can adequately hammer out in very clear black and white ways what is the difference between true and false accompaniment with the culture. I would simply say, as a general rule, that if one is now, when you examine your Catholic faith, and you begin to realize that you don't really agree with the church on a whole range of issues, and that when you examine your thoughts on those issues, you discover that you're more in tune with modern secular Western culture and those values, then that's a pretty good indication right there that you've allowed the cultural tail to wag the ecclesial dog, that your faith isn't really in Christ and his church. It's in the world with some sort of Jesus sprinkles on top of the ice cream. But it's essentially a secular ice cream with just Jesus toppings on top. Okay. And largely a Jesus of your own projection and therapeutic construction. So I would say the best way, and that's why we have church teaching. This is why we're Catholics and not Protestants. The great value of settled magisterial, creedal, dogmatic teachings is that when we look at them and we say, you know what, I don't completely understand these things. Some of these things I'm not certain I completely agree with. As a Catholic, you give them the presumption of the doubt, you give them the presumption of truth, and then you grapple with it, you wrestle with it, you make sure that you form your mind, your soul, your entire being around the truth of those assertions, even if you don't completely understand them. And so I would say that if you are attempting to do that, to take church teaching seriously, take the scriptures seriously, and that those are your baseline, that's where you start, and that your assumption is that I have to convert my mind to that instead of the other way around,
Yeah.
then I think you can be pretty certain that your accompaniment with whoever you want to accompany in the world is going to be guided by the proper theological Catholic principles. And in so living those principles yourself give you a connatural ability to adjudicate when you should speak up and evangelize and when you should just keep your pie hole shut and sit back and
Yeah.
listen to somebody, in other words, evangelization isn't just shouting gospel truths at people. It's an art about knowing if, when, and how to speak to people delicately, diplomatically, and on the level of friendship. But you can only do that in a proper sense of accompaniment if it's grounded in the truths of the faith.
So basically, it's, I think a lot of it, and I think there's some people who only take it in this direction, but like the presuppositionalists. But I think there is a certain point where, we kind of have to talk like the presuppositionalists a little bit and the foundationalists and saying, what's your standard of truth? And so it kind of seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like what you're saying is we all have some standard of truth. And to be a Catholic means to recognize, and to be a Christian means to recognize Jesus and God, as the standard of truth, and the church
Yes.
as the means by which this truth is, passed on. And so how you've been formed more by the church or by the world is, do you use the church and scripture and Jesus as the standard by which you judge the world?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
do you attempt to interpret what Jesus, what the church, what scripture say in light of whatever the latest values of the world are? And so is that the distinction? That seems like that's the distinction you're
Yeah,
trying to.
I think that's an important distinction. And, one has to avoid simplistic forms of triumphalism, like, oh, I've got the truth and the world is just filled with error. There are God's truth can also be found in the world. God's truth can be found in a lot of places outside of the church, because the Holy Spirit moves in mysterious ways. And therefore, even though one begins with church teaching as your bell cow, as your barometer, as your lodestar, you begin with that, stay with that. It is also important to educate yourself, broadly speaking, about all manner of subjects in the world, so that you can then bring that knowledge, that greater knowledge, say, of biology and psychology and sociology and history. You bring that then to the truths of the faith, to see if maybe there aren't elements of the church's teachings that you maybe can be enhanced by certain insights of the modern world, or that you might deepen your understanding of church teaching by paying attention to truths in the world and so forth. So it's not simply a relationship of truth to error. It's a relationship of foundational truths that you hold with a bedrock certitude that you then bring to the world to engage the world in a conversation. And yes, you correct the world where you find the world to be in error, but then you also have the ability, because you're grounded in the faith, to see truths in the world that you can say, aha, wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think that has a bearing on the faith. Oh my goodness, just like, okay, we have this beautiful church teaching on marriage, okay, on the theology of marriage, the sacrament of marriage, proper sexual relation in marriage, procreation, the raising of children, the family as domestic church, blah, blah, blah. But then there are insights from modern sociology, modern psychology, and so forth about human relations and how men and women relate to one another that can definitely enhance our understanding of the marital sacrament in ways that maybe we couldn't 500 years ago. And there's a lot of error in modern psychology too, but there's a lot of truth to it too. And so you have to have that reciprocal conversation, I think, so as not to simply become an enclosed, insular, sort of very insufferable, dogmatic person.
Yeah. And so it's, I mean, one thing, it's the heavens proclaim the glory of the Lord. It's the notion that the created realm reflects its creator. And you also have the notion that, human reason can know some truths about God, which is why there's certain religious truths that can be found in all religions.
Yeah.
But you also have to keep in mind that you have to know how to be able to discern truth from falsehood, which means you have to know what's your standard of truth. And so, if you say the ultimate truth, the ultimate standard of truth is what's said in a false religion, instead of just saying, well, there are some true things in it, or then that leads down the
Yeah.
road of heresy. If you're saying the ultimate standard of truth is what I can just know about the natural world and that's it, then you're essentially going on the realm of materialism, nominalism, empiricism. But I think this is sort of the last main point that I think we should discuss, and that is, there is an institutional element of it. God's revelation was passed on in a specific set of traditions in a religious text. We do have a church that's capable of helping us to interpret the truth, that can pass on and interpret the truth in a definitive way. But I think there's also this desire on the part of some people to restrict the the gospel to merely its institutional elements. And I think people tend to overlook the notion that the institutional elements of the church work best when they are born out of um, when they're born out of a deep personal encounter with Jesus. And I think, that's sort of a stereotype of Catholicism and of organized religion, that, oh, we attempt to constrict Jesus. But I think in
Yeah.
some sense it's ironic, but in the period in which the church has become more it's done more to strongly emphasize this notion of you need a personal encounter with Jesus. That's the same period in which I think the church has become double down on its bureaucratic elements. And that's something I've heard you speak about before. And so what do you think is, like, how do you counteract that without necessarily saying we don't need a church, we don't need a pope, we don't need a whatever? How do you affirm the necessity of all of that while also saying Jesus can't necessarily, like, that it's not just about bureaucratic processes, it's about Jesus and an
The
encounter
heart,
with Jesus?
it's simple. The heart and soul of the church, the reason why she exists is to communicate the risen Lord to the world, that she is the medium through which the risen Lord gets into the world, so to speak. And therefore, all of the various ways the church manifests that are to be given priority over the bureaucratic structure of the church. Now, the church has to have bureaucratic structures. It is an institution in the world that that has organizational patterns to it. Christ didn't just start a spirituality; he founded a church on human beings with authority, who passed that authority on, and so on. So there's a necessary let's put it, institutional element, bureaucratic element in the church. But one has to be very, very careful not to allow the bureaucratic element to smother the purpose behind having the bureaucratic element. In other words, the apostolic structure of the church, or her hierarchical status, is geared towards, it's a means to an end. It's geared towards something else. And that something else is the engendering of sanctity, the engendering of holiness in individuals. And therefore, we have to become a church of energizing the various charisms in the church. The church has always been at her most vibrant and at her strongest when there are all kinds of different ecclesial movements bubbling up from below, whether in the creation of new religious orders by, like, a Teresa of Avila, or Catherine of Siena, a Francis of Assisi, Ignatius of Loyola, Saint Dominic. Okay, those kinds of spiritual powerhouses that simply arise from below. So the church has got to be in the business of creating these kinds of saints, these kinds of powerhouses. As Peter Morin said, the church has to release its dynamite, to explode its dynamite. And that dynamite is the energizing of these various charisms that we see in the church. Only that then will unleash the full Christ in a kaleidoscopic fashion, where each saint, in a sense, gives us a slightly different picture of Christ. Every charism gives us a slightly different participation and therefore picture in Christ. And so I would say this, that's a very expansive view of Christ. You mentioned that the criticism is the church constricts Christ. No, the church, if it's acting properly by energizing various charisms and engendering holiness and creating saints, actually creates a very expansive understanding of Christ. The most constricted vision of Christ imaginable is that of the modern secularist atheist, who views Jesus of Nazareth as nothing more than a kind of enlightened Jewish rabbi who wandered around Galilee preaching a message of love and then sort of got himself killed by the Romans, and that was that. And then his followers made up this cult about him. But that Jesus was essentially just a Jewish prophet, rabbi, moral teacher. That's a very constricted view of Jesus, far more constricted than what the church has to offer.
And it's what's even more constrictive, or equally constrictive, I would say, is the notion that Jesus is whatever I say he is. Jesus
Yeah.
mean to me, you know. And so I think that's a good point that you raised, that the church is at its best when it's basically a church of saints. And so I guess basically I would like to end basically with a twofold question. And firstly, how would you define sanctity? You had kind of alluded to it a little bit as sanctity as imitation of Christ, participation in his goodness. But if you'd like to elaborate a little bit more on that, and then sort of dovetailing on that, what would be, considering the nature of the church, the role of the saints, and the duty of the saints to sort of engage and uplift society, what would be, your biggest message to people who are trying to evangelize?
The big message is sanctity is essentially, like you said, patting ourselves after the pattern of Christ. It's the imitatio Christi. Well, what was the pattern of Christ's life? His pattern was kenosis, descent, humility. His pattern was cruciform. Jesus said, take up your cross and follow me. When Jesus says to Peter, Peter has just confessed, hey, you're the Messiah. And Jesus says, okay, you're the rock. You get it. You rock. All right. and then Jesus says, okay, now I got to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to be crucified. And Peter turns and says to him, oh, that'll never happen. Far be it, Lord, that will never. And Jesus turns to Peter in that moment, of course, you know the story, and says, get behind me, Satan. Now you're speaking as a man speaks, and not God. And so what Jesus is reminding Peter is that the path to the cross is the essential aspect of his life, Christ's life, and that it is to be the essential aspect of our life as well. And as Peter eventually gets crucified upside down in Rome, that this is the pattern of our Christian existence. That is sanctity, to live cruciform lives, which means when we evangelize, unless we are living cruciform lives, our evangelization is going to fall flat. It's just so much hypocrisy. Oh, well, what is a cruciform life? Well, that's going to depend on your state in life. If you're a parent, by being the most self-sacrificing parent you could possibly be, where you are willing to die for your children, and you give everything of your very existence for the sake of your children. If you're single and you're simply working at some job someplace, then your cruciform existence takes the form of being as completely present in a self-sacrificing way to your friends and acquaintances and colleagues as you possibly can be. And then saying, you get where I'm going, priests, nuns, bishops, this is the same pattern that we all must follow. The pattern of the cross, the pattern of humility, the pattern of self-sacrifice. That is what most characterizes sanctity. And every great doctor of the church, every great saint has pointed this out.
Yeah. And that certainly is, I mean, the irreplaceable ingredient of Christianity. Without that, Christianity is absolutely meaningless, and there is no good
Yeah.
news apart from, Jesus's self-emptying, that we may, be glorified in him and with him. And so that is definitely a good note to end on. And so again, I'd like to thank you so much, Mr. Chapp, for coming on with us, and
No problem.
hopefully we can speak again in the future.
I'd be happy to, Cole. That's great. Thanks for having me on. It was a fun conversation.
Definitely. Well, thank you again. Have a great day, and thank you
Hey,
so
you
much
too.
for joining us.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Bye now.